Sasanji Okazaki was born in Japan in 1875. He left his wife and his 4 young children in 1898 to seek his fortune in San Francisco by way of Canada. He started in Canada and worked his way south, arrived here, spent a little bit of time in San Francisco, and then settled in Sonoma County working for a fruit farmer. His son, Ichimaru, came in 1912. The family legend is that he came to retrieve his father, who was spending all of the family money here and not sending it back to Japan. There's probably a little bit of truth to that, but in fact, there was a law at the time that was established in 1908 restricting Japanese immigration. Only people who had a laborer here could come if they were a wife or a child. Otherwise, they could come if they were a scholar. No one else could come. So Ichimaru came by himself at the age of 17. There was another law in place, which was in Japan. Young men who turned 18 would be conscripted into the Japanese Imperial Army. So that may have had something to do with it as well. Ichimaru came in 1912. His brother came in 1913. A second brother came in 1915, and a sister came in 1916. All but the sister passed through for a few days on Angel Island. Ichimaru eventually got married and had some children. The intent was always to go back to Japan. Another law of the time was that Asians could not become citizens, so they would plan on returning to Japan. Sasanji went back to Japan. 2 brothers went back to Japan. Unfortunately, Pearl Harbor got in the way of Ichimaru. On the day that Pearl Harbor was bombed, within 3 hours there was an arrest warrant issued for Ichimaru. He and his family spent the next 4 years in 7 different incarceration facilities in 4 different states before they were deported back to Japan. Their American-born children lost their American citizenship, and they were ineligible for Japanese citizenship. So it's really a tale of tragedy on all ends. Eventually, the 2 children did get their citizenship back. So how does that relate to my family? Well, my ancestor was living here at the time. We think about all the immigrants who came through Angel Island, but this was a virtual city. There were people who worked here. There were doctors. There were maintenance people. And how did that happen to be? William Ambrose was born in England in 1860. He sailed through Australia before settling in San Diego. He worked his way northward, arriving in San Francisco and then working up to Sonoma County, just like Sasanji. Instead of working for a fruit farmer, he worked for a fruit canner. Probably met his wife there. They bought a home, settled in San Francisco. The difference here is that William was Caucasian, and William was an English immigrant who was eligible for citizenship. And in 1913, he petitioned to become an American citizen, something that the Okazakis could never do. So as he applied for citizenship, he also applied for a job. And on August 1st of 1914, William Ambrose became a night watchman here on this island in the quarantine station. And he worked here for 11 years. It was hard work. He had to provide for his family, his wife and his 2 children who were still living in San Francisco. He worked 14-hour days. He was paid $55 a month. He worked the night shift. What that meant is he worked the rounds. He was probably exposed to a lot of chemicals while he was here. If you go through the personnel papers of the men who worked here, there were fumigants used on the island. The family legend of William Ambrose is that he suffered from the chronic effects of the fumigants. I don't think I'll ever be able to prove that, but I can prove that he spent at least 120 days in the hospital here on this island for some sort of a debilitating illness before he was eventually let go because of this debilitating illness. He died about a year later in San Francisco. And that in itself is a pretty tragic story as well. And then what happened was a number of years later, the 2 families crossed paths again, but this time we're both American citizens.
Thanks, Linda. Linda has a wonderful display that will be in the inside the immigration station, like a lot of other displays. What she mentioned about her, the Okazaki family, having Ichimaru's family being arrested and taken away to camps that's actually very relevant to Angel Island, because a lot of people don't know, but for a few weeks, a number of people were brought from Hawaii as well as the U.S. mainland to be detained at Angel Island on their way to camps in the interior of the U.S. These are not the War Relocation Agency camps that people know about, like Manzanar or Tule Lake or Topaz, but there are other ones. They're more like low security prisons in places like Santa Fe, New Mexico, Missoula, Montana, and the boatloads that came from Hawaii. There were people arrested on Pearl Harbor Day or soon after, and they were taken on about 8 different ships, and they all came through Angel Island. And most of them stayed for a few weeks. There are only a couple accounts about these people, and one of them, I think we have them here at Angel Island. One is by a man named Harms Okazaki, who was a journalist. He was an amazing journalist. He kept notes on every single person he met. So he has in his diary, I was on Angel Island, I met these people, and he has all their names. And sure enough, we've confirmed that they exist through the National Archives in Maryland. And then for the mainlanders, they came from San Francisco. There was a shoe repairman. There are a lot of Buddhist and Shinto reverends were arrested, and they were detained in what used to be the immigration station. Because by then, this building where you're standing on now, the footprint of it, had burned down. And so this building was vacant until the war, when it was the barracks housed both prisoners of war as well as Japanese immigrants who were rounded up and taken to Angel Island and then those camps I mentioned. So we're working on a research project funded by the National Park Service, and hope to have the results of that in October, which we'll tell you about later. Okay, so now we have Kay Speaks. She's of Chinese and Irish descent, and she's also an amazing genealogist like Linda. She's done extensive research on both sides of her family, and we still haven't got her to go to her ancestral village in China, though. We're really working on to get out there. And she's lectured extensively about both genealogical research methods and what she's learned about her own family. And she'll also have a wonderful display inside room 105. Okay?
It's nice that you're all here. This place has lots of memories, and I don't want to say they're ghosts, but people listen, and when it's time for the information to be disclosed, it happens. It's the serendipity that we all know about when you do your research. It's pretty amazing. Last year, we were in the immigration station in the mess hall, and that's where my family was. I went upstairs. If you haven't gone upstairs to where the Chinese were detained, the first time I saw that, the shadows of the windows just caught my interest. And I think about that a lot. One day more poetry will come from that. But I know that my elder uncle, who came over for my father and his mother and younger sister, was probably detained with the adults. He would be too short to be able to see out the window, so what he saw on the outside was going to be the shadows from those windows. And it's part of the storytelling of trying to understand what our ancestors experienced. So do take a trip upstairs. Imagine that you're about seven years old, and see what you could see. You couldn't see the outside necessarily. Whereas my father, he stayed here with my grandmother and his younger sister, right where I'm standing. So this is a special moment, because he told me it wasn't too bad. They gave us toys to play with. He didn't know that all the other children came in and they were free. He was really around 5, but they said he was 6 years old. His interrogation record is 42 pages long, but he was old enough to answer the questions. And I know that he didn't have those words in his vocabulary to even be part of that story. So you know that it was rather fill in the blanks, I think. But he was here, and he told me it wasn't too bad. They gave us toys, and I got to sit on the ground and play with toys all day. So it's pretty amazing right here. Any case, we knew nothing about our family. They didn't talk about the history. They didn't talk about coming over. My grandfather had passed away on Easter in 1945. His only American grandchild was my elder sister, who was born in February of the same year. So Grandpa was just a photo, a painting on the wall. And then one day, I was 50, so this has got to be 15 years ago, I was standing at a family reunion on the ranch where we were all meeting. My brother, my cousin, and myself. There was a reunion, and we were just, as children, we were told never to talk about the murder mystery that was in our family. We didn't know it was a murder, it was just a mystery. And we could hear the echoes of the family laughing, and we were just quiet moment. We're all standing, kind of looking down. And I whispered out of the blue, "Don't you ever wonder what happened to him?" And I heard two whispers back, "Yes." And it was the first time we actually made eye contact and had conversation with anybody in the family about what we knew was a murder. We didn't know anything about it. We knew it was my great uncle's wife, and that was it. We didn't know her name. We didn't know what happened. We didn't know the time that it occurred. And it was my cousin who was one of the people that whispered. It was his grandmother. He knew nothing about her. So we decided that we were going to find out what had happened, so that when our elders passed away, we would know, that part of the history that was going to be lost. We thought it would be easy. I went to my father and asked for permission to research. He said yes. So I said, "Tell me about it." And he didn't know anything about it. It was before he came to America. So I have storyboards for all of this, and I only have my 7 minutes to talk about it. So that's the little intriguing part, to come visit me upstairs. I want you to experience and think about the people that was standing, that lived in these buildings. They came with hope and dreams of freedom. They were being murdered at home. The reason that they sent my father, my uncle, they were paper sons, they acted like they were fellow villagers and not family, was to survive. It was bad. The bandits would come in, they would take the food, they would kill people. My grandmother, they came to her house, and because Grandpa's and Grandma's parents worked with the government, they came in and they just, on horses, and killed him. When they came back and discovered it, my grandmother remembers going down to the river with her mother, because when there was blood in the house, it had to be cleaned with river water. And her grandmother crying, and everybody crying. And then they went out shopping a couple of weeks later, and the soldiers came back. And my grandmother and her brother were out gathering fruit, and they murdered her mother. It was part of exterminating a family. So if you read the history, sometimes what they do, it's 5 generations. They try to kill 5 generations, and they exhume a person, ceremoniously kill them, and that generation of family is gone. So people ask, why did you come? Why did they immigrate? They were immigrating to preserve a family. And the history of that family is going to be lost unless you and your ancestors talk about it, learn about it, ask the questions, because your history is important. Your history is important. Everybody if you go back far enough, came from an immigrant. And my relatives wouldn't talk about it. My aunts and uncles, the lady that was murdered, their kids were really small. They didn't even remember what their mother looked like. And then about 7 years ago, when the three sisters were the two sisters were still living, one of them came to me at a family event and whispered to me, "Do you have a picture of my mother? Because I don't remember what she looks like." She was about 3 years old. She remembered enough of that tragic event when her mother was murdered on the ranch and set on fire. The neighbors came, and we found out that it was actually a family member that had an argument. Anyway, I have the storyboards. It's a long story, but it ends up where things want to be found. And one day, I went out on Google, so keep searching. And it's the serendipity of when things want to be found. I'd gone out and I put in Leung Phuc's name for years. And then all of a sudden, up comes this picture. And his trial is cited for every insanity case that ever comes up in the U.S. history. His part is that if you have the insanity, it's always one case, and you try it first the insanity, the first. So a Leung Phuc is that example. And I thought to myself, oh my, what am I going to say to my aunts and my family when this person that murdered her mother is infamous, and nobody will ever remember the rest of the family unless someone like me, someone like you, record the history. So my goal in life is I do a lot of research. I don't do people's research for them. I'm asked repeatedly. But it is a journey that you need to take personally. I would help anyone that I have the knowledge to help make that journey because it is so special. What you learn about you, where you came from, how important family is. And a lot of times you think nobody cares. Well, my family are always saying, when are you going to write the book? And I tell them, I've been writing the book for a long time. I write poetry about my genealogy. I share that with them. But because they don't really get that interested, it bores them, I write it in emails. I write the stories about the uncle that sacrificed his life to raise 2 generations of family. He stayed a bachelor. He was lonely. He became addicted to alcohol. But you know, he sacrificed his life by raising his siblings after my grandfather passed away. And then he ended up raising a lot of us too. So he had a history that I write about in email. So now my nieces and nephews, and I have a lot of them, ask me to resend the email because they just deleted it without reading it. They ask for it in Facebook. Facebook isn't going to be around forever. It has to be something that can be recorded so that somebody that's sitting here 100 years from now will be able to see the stories. So I don't mean to leave you hanging. I would be glad to tell you this story because it is serendipity. Every once in a while, something will happen. I'm standing across the street and I find out that when I asked a Chinese woman what the Chinese says under Grant Street, it's a street that I had been looking for years. Because when they rebuilt Chinatown, they kept the Chinese names on the streets, but Grant Street isn't the original name. And I had been standing and walking past the building that my grandfather's immigration records, as his paper son said he was